Like, what is the first step into renting a home like this?
Renting a home? So right now I've got to the point where I'm hiring a property manager to rent out the homes for me. But if you're looking to rent out a home by yourself, basically what you do, you take good photos, right? You write up a good description about the home, the area, the neighborhood, right? All the selling features of the space. You post it on the different websites, so like Facebook Marketplace, Kijiji. Zumper has been a good one where we post it there and it kind of posts it on multiple sites. People inquire, you then call them back, book appointments for them to come see the place, and then you have them fill out like a tenant application. So they kind of give their information. You sometimes pull a credit check to check their credit, and then based on the applications, you will kind of decide if you want to go with one of them. If you have a good application, if you don't, then you kind of reevaluate the rental price that you've put to charge. So we always start at a little bit higher price. If it doesn't quite hit, we knock it down a little bit to adjust it. But it's a pretty straightforward process. It is quite a bit of work. People think that it's something that's done very quickly, and it can sometimes be done quickly. But I find that, if you're really searching for a good tenant, it can sometimes take a bit of time, and you need to be patient, because if you find a tenant, if you rent your home to a tenant that's not as ideal, then you're constantly dealing with problems. Versus if you wait for the right tenant, then once you find the right tenant, it's a much smoother process. And then once you find the right person, you sign a contract basically stating the terms of the rental agreement, how much they're charging, what they're responsible for, utilities, etc., right? And then they move in, right? So that's pretty much the process to rent out a home. Obviously, I went over it very quickly, so there may be a lot of details I missed there.
Yeah,
But
it's just relevant to the kind of tenant you're signing with. And like there could be that sort of long waiting period. What are like the downsides of that?
to wait for the right tenant? Yeah, I mean, it could take some time. Some of my clients have waited as much as 3-4 months, right? Sometimes even as long as 6 months. Usually there's something else wrong when it takes that long. But I usually tell my clients to budget between 2 to 4 months. 4 months even is long. 2 months usually is what it should take. And then if you're in a really good neighborhood, it typically rents much faster. So we find that between the nice neighborhood and not the rough areas, but like the kind of not as nice, but still decent areas, you get almost similar rents. The nice neighborhoods don't necessarily rent for much more, but what we find in the nicer neighborhoods is that they rent immediately to really good tenants, versus in the not as nice neighborhoods, you're kind of waiting a little bit to find good tenants. You'll get a lot of applications. People will be interested, but not all of them would be maybe the tenant quality that you would want to rent your home to. So you end up waiting a little bit longer, I would say, in the areas that are not as prime within the city. And this is also kind of specific to Welland and the smaller towns. If you're in Toronto, you may not have this problem. Your tenant quality may be through the roof, even if you have a property in a not as nice area, but this is specific to this town. Yeah. The risk on the other end is much worse though. If you get a terrible tenant, I have one client that is really struggling right now. They put in a tenant, everything seemed good, guy works for Canada Post, government job, steady income, family that wants to live in it was just a single family home, but I don't know where we could have done more to screen for the tenants, but they haven't paid rent in over a year, and they've tried to go through the eviction process with the landlord tenant board, and because it takes a while to evict a person, right? It's not just a straightforward process. So they spent a few months waiting for the court date, go to the court, show their case, takes a few months more, gets a judgment to leave. COVID happened, then it got extended even more, and now finally they got the judgment for them to be evicted from the home, and they haven't paid rent in probably over a year, maybe even a year and a half. They've been forced to lose that amount of money for that much time. So in my mind, waiting 1, 2, 3 months for the right tenant is much, much better than renting to the wrong tenant and then suffering a year and a half of no rent, going to landlord tenant board, hiring paralegals, right? There's a lot more downside risk that way. So it's definitely very important to protect yourself by finding the right person.
So how would you deal with something like that, aside from going through the eviction process, which, like you mentioned, can last a ridiculous
Forever.
amount of time? Yeah.
There's very few things you can do, right? You can. I know some landlords that have terrible tenants who the landlord will literally offer the tenant money to leave. So it's that crazy, because you have to think about it, right? Like if a unit will typically rent for $1,500, every month that they don't get rent, they're losing that $1,500. So in some cases, they would rather pay $3,000, $5,000 to a tenant than wait a year to get. Now, it doesn't always take a year. Usually it's about 6 months, start to finish, to evict a tenant, if the tenant doesn't want to leave. Because you can't just ask the tenant to leave, right? Even if you get the eviction order, you still can't ask the tenant to leave. You have to wait until you book a date for the sheriff to come to the house, and the sheriff will literally change the locks on the property. Up to that point, you still can't do anything. And I've heard of cases where the sheriff comes and the tenant doesn't want to leave, and then the sheriff also is kind of in the spot where they can't physically kick the person out, so they're kind of waiting there. They call the cops. The cops are not sure of, are we allowed to kick someone out of their own home, even though we have a judgment order from the landlord tenant board. The guy hasn't paid rent in 6 months, but it's quite a messed up system. So in a way, the way we buy rental properties is almost geared to mitigate those risks. So we buy nice homes in nice neighborhoods. When we make it into a duplex, we really renovate it well to a high standard, so that it's easier to attract a really good tenant. And most of the tenants we try to rent to are tenants who are then looking to buy their own home 2, 3, 4 years later. They want to keep their credit good. They don't want to screw up with not making payments and potentially losing their creditworthiness to be able to go buy a home, right? So they are probably one of the best tenants. They stay for a couple of years. They're there. They save up money. They go buy a house. And they usually leave the home in good condition. So that's our ideal tenant profile, because then every couple of years we can adjust the rent based on the market, and also while they're there, they're typically a better tenant. This is why I personally don't like to buy the smaller multifamily properties in the downtown neighborhoods, in the rougher parts of, for example, Welland, just because the type of tenant you're going to attract is not going to be the type of person who's going to go ahead and buy their home later. So I'm sure you can still find good tenants, but you need to be very careful when you're screening your tenants to make sure you find, good tenants. So